Thank you, sir. Ms. Leake is going to ask the first question.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Ms. Swinson. Just one issue. I represent Paula Vennells. You said this morning that Ms. Vennells, and I quote, knew about the clerk advices. Just one point arising from that. Are you aware that there is no evidence to suggest that Ms. Vennells was ever shown either of the Simon Clark advices by Susan Crichton or any other post office lawyer before she left the post office?
In preparing for the inquiry, I've been shown an email from October 2013 where Paula Vennells emails Alice Perkins, I think before going on leave, and I don't know if we have
yes.
have the specific wording, but so I may not remember precisely, but it basically says along the lines of, my concern about Horizon or Sparrow is our obligations of disclosure regarding an unsafe witness, which to me says that she knows that there was an unsafe witness and therefore is referring to the Clark advice. Now, if she...
Let me stop you there. Is it right to say then the extent of your knowledge about what Paula Vennells was told is based on that particular email?
Well, she certainly didn't tell me about it, and I wish she had.
Yes, but
and she should have
I'm
done.
trying
Yes,
to
it's
explore
that
with
email,
you what you knew about what she had been told about the Simon Clark advices, and I want to establish, is that based solely on that email?
From that email,
yes.
To me it's clear she knew of the at least existence of the Clark advice, and I would have thought that any chief executive being given information of that level would have asked to then see the document on which that came from.
Are you aware
but
she was
I don't know if she did or didn't.
Right, so you don't know that she was not given a copy of the Simon Clark advice. The entirety of your knowledge is based on that email between Paula Vennells and Alice Perkins.
I don't know if she asked for the Clark advice. I know that she must have known about its existence, because where else would she have got that information about the unsafe witness?
No, I just want to establish, it's not a difficult question, the extent of your knowledge is based on the email that you're referring to.
Yes, and that email, I think, speaks for itself.
All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, Ms. Swinson. Hello. I represent a large number of sub-postmasters and mistresses who were ill-treated by the post office in this scandal. Paragraph 131 of your statement, you say you felt that instead of being provided with the important information on post office's motivations and plans in a timely way, there's no need to turn it up, I was kept at arm's length and was being managed. Does that sum up your general experience in the way that you were briefed on the Horizon issue, being kept at arm's length and managed?
Yes, I think that is what was happening. That's what they were attempting to do. I did ask and probe on lots of different elements of this, but the advice was, as you will see from the documents, very clear, always to encourage me that this was an operational matter, and then reassurances provided in various ways.
Thank you. And you've given two examples of cases where you weren't properly informed. You say that you weren't told that Second Sight were to be sacked, bound by confidentiality and records destroyed, and you would have objected strongly if you'd known. And you also talk about you weren't told that the chief executive was considered to be unfit to do the job. And in relation to that last point, you've described the manoeuvrings of the shareholder executive this morning as Orwellian. Is that right?
I think in the specific case that I used that language, it was about them knowing that the post office was changing its position on how it engaged with the mediation scheme, and then telling me that other people were trying to reinterpret the terms of reference. And I think another example would be, there was a select committee on the 3rd of February. You know, I asked about the outcome of that select committee, you know, what happened, could I be, you know, given information about that, and I was basically told there was nothing unexpected. I think that'd be another example when Second Sight actually said they were concerned about unsafe prosecutions, where I should have been given information having asked for a readout of the select committee.
That's very helpful, thank you. In your evidence, you've confirmed, I think, that Richard Callard was one of the people who kept you out of the loop. And you've given examples, and we've heard, him writing, "I want to get her in the right place" on Sparrow. I don't want to ask you about him. Those clients that we have are interested to know which of the senior individuals within the shareholder executive you blame, in addition to Mr. Callard, for the state of affairs that led to you being kept at arm's length and managed in this way. And I'm going to give you some names. Will Gibson, Mike Whitehead, Peter Batter, Laura Thompson, and Tim McInnes. Now, I give you those names because those are the names that feature in the documents that we've been referred to in your evidence. There may be some other individuals. So do you think those individuals are to blame, and to what extent?
So I have been specific in my criticism of Mr. Callard, and part of the reason for that, rather than generally naming lots of civil servants, is that from the documents I've seen, I can now know that he was on that Sparrow subcommittee, and so I have good reason to believe he knew things that he wasn't telling me. What I don't know about those other officials is how much of their information was therefore reliant on what Richard Callard was telling them, or indeed questions they were asking of Post Office Limited, which is why I would be reluctant to go into a more, detailed kind of naming. But because of that specific role on the board, I have information that Richard Callard knew about things. And I would just reiterate what I said earlier on, that my general experience of dealing with civil servants is that they were public-spirited, they were diligent in doing their jobs. I think this seems to me to have been exceptional. That's one of the reasons why I find it so shocking. This is an issue that affected so many people, and the only way ministerial oversight could operate properly on that is with, frank and full advice. And that's why I'm angry that that was not provided, because it had so many impacts on real lives.
I think you said at the conclusion of your evidence in your statement, no need to turn it up, at paragraphs 146 to 148, that there are a number of recommendations that you make. One of the things that you say is that the solution to the way arm's length government-owned bodies are viewed and looked at and checked by the government might be a cultural solution. And my final question for you is, from your experiences, were there any cultural problems within the shareholder executive that you want to tell the inquiry about today?
To be clear, I don't think a cultural solution is sufficient, but I also am supportive of the suggestions that have come out, for example, about the duty of candour. But I would also say that any official duty like that being put in will also not be sufficient without the right culture in place. And I do think there was a different culture in Shecs that was not of the usual civil service culture, which, as I say, I found was generally a very helpful one that was focused on the public good. And I think while there is a need, obviously, to have relevant commercial experience when you're dealing with companies, actually that mindset of public service is an incredibly important part of what needs to be present in all civil servants, even when dealing on commercial matters. And I think that's the cultural element that is important to instill.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions for you.
Thank you.
Ms. Swinson, I've just got a hypothetical for you. Let's assume that we're back in 2014 and the document which related to the appraisal of Paula Vennells' ability to carry on as chief executive had in fact been drawn to your attention, all right? And let us assume that you had been persuaded of the validity of some of those criticisms. Would it actually have been your decision as to whether she would have been invited to leave the organization? Or if not, how would the decision have been made?
I certainly don't think it would have solely rested with me,
Right.
because I think Vince Cable would have rightly been involved in that decision. I do not know if it would have been I mean, something like that would not have been on, the whim of the Secretary of State. So I would imagine that would have been in discussion with the board. But had those concerns been drawn to my attention when I returned from maternity leave, then that would have been a conversation with Vince. It would have presumably been conversations with other, with the officials from Shecs, and then potentially with the rest of the Post Office board. It would have totally changed the view on whether it made sense to, appoint somebody else in terms of, a strong CFO. There would have been a lot of things that were different, and of course, assurances given by Paula Vennells about Horizon in that context would have been viewed very differently.
Yeah, I'm not actually seeking to inquire into Ms. Vennells herself. I was really concerned about the process. So if I summarised it in this way, that it would have come to you in the first instance, but ultimately it would also have gone to the Secretary of State. There would have been wide consultation, and would I be right in then adding that ultimately it would have been a decision of the Secretary of State?
That's my understanding.
Fine. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So
nothing else, Mr. Blake?
We have some brief questions from Ms. Patrick and Ms. Watt.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry to have jumped in. I assumed that was it. Sorry.
Yeah, apologies for the technical difficulty of my... If Ms. Watt wants to go first, I'll try. Here we go, sorry. Actually, there we go. Hi, Ms. Swinson, my name's Angela Patrick. I also act for a number of sub-postmasters. You can see Mrs. Hamilton to my left and Mr. Brentall to my right. We have, sorry, Mr. Brentall, I apologise. Got one of my clients' names wrong there. Ms. Swinson, I apologise for the break there with the technical difficulty. I only want to look at one document, and it's the document Mr. Blake spoke to you about this morning, the Fujitsu document, where you said you prompted yourself to reframe your decision and your reaction in more parliamentary language. I don't think we need to bring it up, but I'll give the reference so that we can have it in case we need to look at it. It's FUJ 20174-179. And we don't really need to look at it, I don't think. You said, and you've admitted, you wished you'd spoken to Second Sight, you wished you'd spoken to Mr. Bates. Just to be absolutely clear, you didn't speak to Second Sight before the ministerial statement on the 2nd of July 2013.
No, I did not.
And you said you couldn't recall Leslie Sewell being in the room, but there were many officials. I want to ask you about a few other names to see if it might jog your memory. Roderick Williams?
I'm not sure.
Susan Crichton?
I'm afraid I don't know.
And you've given us your reaction about finding out about information that was communicated in the Clark advice. But I just want to ask, if anyone in that room or elsewhere in Post Office knew about bugs, the unsafe witness issue, or that Fujitsu had remote access to Post Office branches, was any of that information that ought to have been briefed up to you before you took to your feet on the 9th of July?
And just to be clear, you said bugs, the remote access issue, and you said one other thing.
The unsafe witness
issue.
Unsafe
witness issue. So certainly not on the unsafe witness issue, and certainly not on remote access.
No, I think we're at cross purposes. I'm not saying was it briefed up to you.
All right.
If they knew, should it have been briefed up to you?
Yes, I believe so. The remote access issue would have been quite a technical element, but given how important it was, then yes, I think the significance of that should have been. The issue of bugs, I would just to be clear, within the Second Sight report, obviously in July 2013, it was recognised that there were some anomalies, and indeed in my statement to the House, I mentioned that no IT system is entirely bug-free, but what's important is that if something like that is identified, that it is rectified, and my understanding was that that had been what had happened. Indeed. Obviously, that was my understanding based on what I'd been told, but that turned out not to be the case.
Indeed. And in your recollection of that group that was huddled in your room, you were being briefed in a hurry for the debate, and the conduct of the Post Office may have been criticised by MPs. Was it a briefing, in your recollection, where both the Post Office and Shecs officials were present?
My recollection is not that clear, but I think it's entirely possible. And having seen the email, perhaps there was somebody from Paul there. As I say, given the urgency of the timing, if there was going to be any points that we needed Paul to confirm or explain, that's possible. But I'm sorry, I can't be more categorical because it was a long time ago and a lot of people in a room.
In a circumstance where you've got an arm's length body that might be subject to criticism by MPs, is there any prospect that that would be a cause for concern for you, that you're being briefed by both the body that might be criticised and the individual officials?
I mean, in order for me to be able to answer the questions from MPs, I would need to understand what Paul's response would be. And obviously, I can only really get that from Paul directly. Obviously, that could come via officials. And in the normal mode of written submissions, that's how I would expect it to work. But in a very time-limited scenario where a debate is happening, if I've got a question and I say, well, hang on, what's happened here? What's the position on this particular area?
I appreciate
My
that.
officials might not know. And so, yes, I wouldn't find it very unusual in that scenario to necessarily have somebody from Paul there.
And who would you rely on to give you an independent view in those kinds of circumstances where an arm's length body might be criticised in a debate?
Well, I mean, obviously, the officials you would hope would have some ability to, have a probing. And indeed, if I was, in a conversation with somebody from Paul, I was doing that myself, right? I wasn't just saying, oh, right, you say that. I would then potentially be able to ask a follow-up question to them to get the understanding. I think in the case of Paul, I had a number of arm's length bodies that I was engaging with as a minister. In the case of Paul, I suppose I felt that we almost had a better opportunity to make sure we got really good information because there was a Ned on the board who was actually a civil servant, so we should have more information.
Stop you there a minute. You would have asked questions, but in this occasion you hadn't read the second sight report, had you?
Well, I cannot categorically say that I had read it in full. I may have scanned it at that point. I had had a debate pack, 3 debate packs in my box the previous evening, and I had been reading as much as I could for all of those debates.
And were you relying on the officials in those circumstances to ensure that you were getting an independent view?
Yes, the officials would be providing policy advice, and there would be a very strong view that what I was being told by officials was factually accurate.
And if we look at that message back to the context there, rightly or wrongly, looking at that conversation within Fujitsu that you wouldn't have seen, would you expect a ministerial briefing being given in the context where an arm's length body was possibly going to be criticised in Parliament to be fed back to a third-party contractor who themselves might be subject to criticism?
I can see that it probably wouldn't have been my expectation at the time that the content of the conversation that I would have had with officials, which I would have expected was a kind of private conversation to understand the issues. So I wouldn't necessarily have expected that to be reported back to somebody else.
Just to be absolutely clear, were you told that Fujitsu were going to be briefed on your briefing?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Swinson. I have no other questions for you.
Thank you.
I appear for the National Federation of Subpostmasters. Just get it into each other's view. Thank you. Throughout your witness statement, you referenced the briefings that you got and the meetings that you had with George Thompson, who at the material time of Horizon was the General Secretary of the NFSP. And the inquiry's heard what he has to say about it all. We also saw a document this morning which said both the NFSP and the Communication Workers Union had expressed confidence in Horizon. So doubtless you took reassurance from these positions? I think nodding,
Yes, sorry. I did, and my experience of dealing with both the NFSP and the CWU during my time as Minister was that neither organisation was shy about being critical where they didn't agree with something. So yes, I did take some reassurance from the fact that they were positive about Horizon.
So I just want to ask you a couple of questions then around the Crown Post Offices and the Post Office's own employees. So thinking about this, Last month, the inquiry heard evidence from Tony Cairns of the CWU that there were approximately 9,000 post office employees working at Crown post offices and using Horizon through that relevant period, and likely they would have been union members, so roughly the same as the membership of the NFSP at the time. He didn't have figures for Crown Office employee prosecutions, except that there was some increase, and thought that some employees probably simply left employment when faced with shortfalls. So perhaps a bit of a different picture as compared to the sub-postmasters. So you've sort of anticipated some of what I'm going to ask. Can you say what sort of engagement you had with the CWU and if they ever raised Horizon with you?
I met with CWU regularly, but not as frequently as with the NFSP. I would maybe a couple of times a year, but I can't be certain without access to those diary records. And I don't recall Horizon being raised by CWU, but it's hard to be absolutely categorical. But most of the discussions with CWU focused around some of the transformation in the Crown estate and the network transformation plans there, and some of their concerns about that.
So thinking about what you were coming to know and had in fact been put before you in relation to the issues about Horizon, although focused on sub-postmasters, did you ever ask them about the Crown Office employees, and were you not concerned about Horizon and how it might be affecting effectively civil servants, the state's own employees?
I don't think I proactively asked the CWU about it. I do remember one conversation with George Thompson from NFSP, but I can't tell you exactly when that was. And it's interesting in noting the figures that you set out, because in terms of, you're right, it's probably a similar number, but actually at the time, that wasn't the way that I conceived of it, because I probably would have considered that NFSP had the vast majority of branches, and then there was a much smaller number of Crown offices, though obviously larger branches. So they weren't raising it, and it wasn't something which I proactively raised with them, to my memory.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir. Those are all the questions. Our plan is to all stay in the room while there is a change of witness.
Right, that's fine. So thank you very much, Ms. Swinson, for making a detailed witness statement and for answering a good many questions today, this morning, and into this afternoon. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you very much, and for all of your work. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, thank you very much.
We're about to hear from Dame Moya Greene.
Yeah.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down.
Please could you state your full name?
Moya Marguerite Greene.
Thank you for attending the inquiry today to give evidence, and also thank you for the detailed witness statement that you have provided. I want to go to that first. It should be in front of you. For the purpose of the record, it's WITN 103-10100. Now, before I ask you to look at your signature, there's two minor clarification points to make. Could we please have page 21, paragraph 59 of the statement on the screen? It's the last sentence. You say the formal separation agreement was signed on 1st April 2012, and I understand you wish to clarify that to the fact that the formal separation agreement was signed in January 2012 and formal separation itself took place on the 1st of April 2012, with further services between the companies ceasing thereafter.
That's correct.
And on the same theme, can we turn to page 40, please? paragraph 119, you say a few months later, on 3rd April 2012, 2 days after the signing of the formal separation agreement, and that, I understand, should read 2 days after formal separation.
That is correct.
Thank you. That document can come down for the time being. Dame Moya, can I ask you please to turn to page 54 of your statement. Do you see a signature? Is
Yes,
that your signature?
yes,
And are the facts in that witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
yes,
That stands as your evidence to the inquiry. It will be published on the inquiry's website shortly. I'm going to ask you some questions about it. I'm not going to ask you questions on everything, but just a few of the key points. I'll start with your background. You spent the first part of your career in the Canadian Civil Service, rising to work in the Privy Council office.
that is correct.
You then served as Assistant Deputy Minister at Transport Canada between 1991 and 1996.
That is correct.
And following that, you held various roles in the private sector, including being President and CEO of Canada Post Corporation between 2005 and 2010.
That is correct.
And in 2010, you became Chief Executive of Royal Mail.
Correct.
And that's what I'm going to focus my questions on now. First, a few very broad questions on your responsibility as CEO. Would you accept that ultimate executive accountability for the operation of Royal Mail, the group, rested with you?
Yes,
Would you agree that identifying, analysing and managing risk is an important part of the executive running of a company?
yes,
In fact, it goes to the heart of the company executive. Would you agree with that?
yes,
And when running a group of companies, considering risk also means considering risk to the subsidiaries.
yes,
Please, could we bring up your statement? It's page 10, paragraph 28. Thank you. Here we see from the title talking about subsidiaries and group companies, and you say the risks associated with the subsidiary entity, such as Post Office, whether these were legal, IT or finance related, would be reported to, it says ARC, that's Audit and Risk Committee, and updates provided to the Royal Mail boards where significant risks were identified or were sufficiently material to impact the financials of the group. You're distinguishing there significant risks and risks that were sufficiently material to impact the financials of the group. What types of significant risks there will you have in mind? Could you give any examples?
yes. We had a very big pension deficit. We had a very large pension program, and the deficit ranged between 4 and 12 billion pounds, depending upon assumptions and time. So that was a very significant risk. We had cash risks in the Royal Mail. There were times when, there were genuine worries that we just did not have enough cash for the operation. We had major risks in the operation. Having had a very good modernization plan, it was difficult to implement it. That was a very big risk for the Royal Mail Group. Those were sort of three major risks. We had a regulatory framework that was archaic and out of date, and we needed a new approach entirely. That was another major risk for Royal Mail going forward, given a very different competitive environment. So those would be 4 examples.
We heard from some witnesses from UKGI and the Shareholder Executive last week, and saw risk registers that they used. And on those risk registers, they included some reputational risks. Would significant reputational risks be something that a subsidiary should report to its parent company?
Yes. The only hesitation I have is that at that time, 2010 to 2012, we were just actually starting to bear down on the establishment of risk management frameworks. But yes, generally, I would agree if there is a very big reputational risk, it should be reported.
And what about the risk that a subsidiary has pursued a prosecution that has potentially resulted in an unsafe conviction?
I think it depends on the scale, if that would be considered a material risk.
Just pausing there, when you say scale, is that referring to numbers or type of conviction?
Numbers, type of conviction, what steps the company is taking to make sure that it doesn't happen again. It just depends. It's only a reputational risk if it bears on how people view the organization going forward.
So, when we had, as I say, the significant risk and the sufficiently material risk to impact the board's financials, I think what you're saying is, when you're referring to significant risk, it still has to be material to the group itself to be reported up from the subsidiary.
I wouldn't be categoric about that, Mr. Stevens. As I said, we were just getting started on the establishment of risk registers and the processes that you put in place, bottom up, top down, to try to identify where the risks were, sifting through to understand what was the scale of the risk. But, by and large, an audit and risk committee would focus on the big risks, and these would be the material risks.
As part of this forming the risk register, as you say, do you recollect, did you ever see on the risk register for Royal Mail or any of its subsidiaries risks relating to the prosecution of Subpostmasters?
No, I don't recall seeing that.
I want to now look at some of the issues relating to IT that were funneled through the, or potentially funneled through the ARC. Please could we start with poll 3030217. So this is a Ernst & Young document. It's a management letter for the year ending 27th March 2011. Do you recall seeing this document whilst in post at Royal Mail?
No, it has been provided from the inquiry to me.
And when the inquiry provided it to you, did you read it?
Yes.
Broadly, would you have expected to be made aware of a letter such as this in your position as Chief Executive of Royal Mail?
Not in detail. The relationship with our external auditors was really primarily with our Chief Financial Officer, Matthew Lester. He and I had a very close working relationship, so any big issues that our outside auditors, E&Y, would have had, he would have told me about. But I wouldn't expect to be told in detail about the management letter for the post office.
Can we look, please, at page 3? It's the executive summary. And it says the main area we would encourage management focus on in the current year is improving the IT governance and control environment. Within the IT environment, our audit work has identified weaknesses, mainly relating to the control environment operated by Post Office's third-party IT suppliers. Our key recommendations can be summarised into the following 4 areas: improve governance of outsourcing application management, improve segregation of duties within the managed change process, strengthen the change management process, and strengthen the review of privileged access. We also encourage management to continue to enhance the legal and compliance review framework to manage risks in relation to regulatory compliance associated with financial services activities. Now, in a moment, we're going to look at some ARC meetings, and I'll ask you about how this was discussed. Before I move on to that, though, I want to ask about one specific part of the matters that were identified. Could we turn to page 23, please? This is just to orientate ourselves. We can see that the title is Current Year Recommendations IT Specific, and it gives a series of recommendations which I don't need to take you through. Could we please go to page 31? In the table at the bottom line, we see it talking about review of privileged access to IT functions. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we go over the page, it starts with PolSAP, which is a back-end system that I'm not going to ask you about. But if we go forward, please. HNGX, which we now know as Horizon Online. That HNGX at the time presumably would have been a phrase of which you were aware.
Actually, I don't recall it, and it has only been raised at Royal Mail board minutes that you've provided a couple of times, but I, of course, now know what HNGX means, Horizon Online.
Presumably you were aware at the time that Post Office was rolling out a new front-end accounting software system?
Yes, generally.
So this this point says, there are inappropriate system privileges assigned to the AppSup role and system manager role at the Oracle database level on the branch database server, BDB, supporting HNGX. And it goes on to describe some more, what it describes as inappropriate privileged access. We've heard a lot about AppSup at the inquiry and generally about remote access. At this point in time, 2011, 2012, that period, were you made aware in any detail of Fujitsu's ability remotely to access branch accounts in the Horizon IT system?
No, I was not. However, in the minutes of the Audit and Risk Committee, it was raised, and it was raised, I think, at the initiative of our chairman, Donald Bryden, but it was raised in a way that was put in the context of Fujitsu not really being prepared for the audit in the previous year. And a lot of work had to be done by our outside auditor to make up for that. So it was raised in a slightly different context, and it certainly was not emphasized.
With hindsight, looking back now, is it the type of detail that you would have expected to be raised at the ARC committee at group level?
That's hard to say. We had so many very big technology risks. As I mentioned in my statement, the Royal Mail technology estate was archaic, complex. We could not really go forward with the modernization program as planned without the ability to improve it. So I am not sure, Mr. Stevens, that this access issue that came up in the context, in a much larger context of the audit work that had been done for the 10-11 year, would have received that kind of emphasis. the technology estate in the Royal Mail Group needed to be completely revamped. So I don't know how much emphasis this particular and what we see now, very important point, would have been given.
Can we look, please, at RMG 6083? So this is Royal Mail Group paper for the, we see date ARC, so it's for the Audit and Risk Committee on the 8th of December 2011. The author and sponsor is Chris Day, the Chief Financial Officer of Post Office. Contributors include Leslie Sewell and Rod Ismay. And its title is Update on Post Office Limited, Horizon Controls and Relationship with Fujitsu. If we could turn the page, please. In fact, sorry, to page 3. It says IT controls and SAS 70 assurance. Earlier, when you were referring to audit, and a discussion at the ARC, were you referring to that SAS 70 assurance?
That is correct.
It also says this in the middle: a number of IT control issues were identified during the 2010-11 year-end audit, which were largely centred on Fujitsu. Overall, Ernst & Young was satisfied that the control systems were reliable, but they made certain recommendations in the management letter following the audit for improvements which have been implemented. The IT control issues identified during the audit did not relate to the integrity of accounting data in the system. Rather, Ernst & Young made recommendations about the documentation and authorization of changes to systems and about opportunities for streamlined assurance. And if we go to page 6, please. Don't need to cover the whole of the paper. At the bottom of the page, please. Talks about the annual audit by Ernst & Young. It says, however, after additional control testing, Ernst & Young confirmed that they were able to place reliance on the existing systems controls. Nevertheless, they suggested certain improvements which could be made, mainly relating to access. Now, do you have any recollection of reading this paper at the time?
I don't have any recollection of reading it, and but what I would say is that it's a very reassuring paper. And so in previous minutes, and again, I don't have any specific recollection of it, the minutes report that our outside auditor was annoyed that they had to do a lot of extra work on their own initiative because Fujitsu did not seem to be ready to do the kind of work that was expected in a year-end audit. And as a result, E&Y did the work. They tested the systems and they tested the control environment. They made a lot of recommendations for improvement, but they were able to reassure the board and the Audit and Risk Committee that they were satisfied that there was integrity in the data that was being used for the purposes of financial reporting. So it's in a context where what anyone would draw from it was that there was a problem with the audit readiness of Fujitsu, but, and these things definitely needed to be corrected, but that it was not problematic in terms of the integrity of the data that had been used in the audit for the purpose of financial reporting. And if I, had focused on it, that's what I would have drawn from it.
I want to come to the meeting at which this was discussed shortly, but can we also look at another point raised in page 7? We see talks about challenges to Horizon, and we know by this point Post Office had received at least 5 letters of claim in the access law Shoesmith related matter.
I only read 4.
It may only have said
Okay.
we don't need to worry with it.
Okay.
It received some letters.
We did, yeah, not, but it was, again, vastly understated relative to what was the scale of the issue, but yes.
Post Office Limited has, over the years, had to dismiss and prosecute a number of sub-postmasters and Crown staff following financial losses in branches. Presumably by this time, so in December 2011, you were already aware of Post Office's involvement in prosecuting sub-postmasters.
You know, Mr. Stevens, I don't remember that, but I have read the documents, and I don't know how much I would have focused on that issue at that time, because, as I mentioned to you, when it came to our audit committee, it came at the initiative of our chairman, who had read Private Eye's article and activated the audit and risk oversight of this matter. And from the reading of the documents that you've provided, it doesn't come across as an issue anywhere near the scale that the issue was. So in answer to your question, I don't know if I would have focused on that.
My question was slightly different. My question was if you knew of Post Office's involvement in prosecuting sub-postmasters. I'm going to come to that in more detail later, so we'll park it there. Looking at paragraph 26, this refers to 4 broad strands of challenge, it says. Prosecution and civil debt recovery actions by POL, where the defence claim Horizon is flawed. These have consistently been won on the facts of Horizon transaction logs. Judges have spoken supportively of Horizon. And then it goes on to discuss threatened civil claims for damages. And it says 4 letters of claim have been received. Of these, 1 is now time-barred, etc. So that's the paper that went there. Let's look at the minutes of the meeting itself, please. It's RMG 703. So you see it's the Royal Mail Holdings Audit and Risk Committee meeting on the 8th of December 2011. If we can go down slightly, please. We see you are there listed second in attendance. And we also have further down Chris Day, Leslie Sewell, and Rod Ismay, who were the 3 sponsors on that paper, yes?
Yes.
If we can go in the paper, please, to, if we could turn the page, please. And again. And sorry, over the page, please. And down, please, to F. Thank you. Pausing there. So challenges to Horizon. It says Post Office Limited has, over the years, had to dismiss and prosecute a number of sub-postmasters and Crown staff following financial losses in branches. So it's very similar wording to what was in the paper. It says the committee noted the update on this matter. Would this have been, would the paper have been supplemented by anyone speaking to it, or would it simply have been read?
I don't remember, but usually if our corporate secretary used the word noted, it was not discussed. And as you can see from the minutes, there are a lot of things on that agenda.
And by that, what's the relevance of that, sorry?
Well, there were a lot of things to get through, and some of them would have been perceived as, at that time, and on the basis of what was known and said to us at that time, some of the other items would have been perceived to be requiring greater allocation of time and discussion.
Can you recall, either at this meeting or at any other point, ever being told that Post Office had pursued a prosecution where a Subpostmaster had raised Horizon as a defence, and that Subpostmaster had then been acquitted?
I don't specifically recall that, but certainly the documentation that you have provided allows me to see an email trail where, as I said, our chairman, Sir Donald Bryden, who was also, up until the time of Mrs. Perkins' appointment, was also the chairman of the Post Office Board. He, having seen an article in Private Eye, activated the audit and risk framework inside Royal Mail. But so I don't personally recall, but I can see that from the documents that you've provided, I have a reasonable picture of what happened.
If we could go up, please, on this document, we see there's a discussion of the... up a bit further, please. Thank you. Update on Horizon controls and relationship with Fujitsu. And again, if we scroll down, we see it's noting matters we covered in the report. In your witness statement, you say that the minutes do not disclose Rod Ismay, who was at this meeting, having made any statement to the committee about Horizon, and you make the point he'd done what we now know as the Ismay report a year earlier. Now, you say the minutes do not disclose it. Do you have a positive recollection on whether Mr. Ismay said or didn't say anything at the meeting?
I don't.
And what about Leslie Sewell?
No, I don't have any recollection. I
Well,
don't have any recollection of a discussion on this matter.
And should we take then from your evidence on this is that the ARC were effectively reassured by the paper, which we went to earlier?
I would think so.
Could we look, please, at poll 3029114? This was a document sent to you by the inquiry. You're listed, as you say in your witness statement, you're listed in the distribution list. Do you have any recollection of ever receiving this or a document like it?
No, I don't have personal recollection, but I believe that this would have been done by the Royal Mail Internal Audit Group, led by Derek Foster, with whom, we had a highly positive professional relationship, to the point that if there had been anything, especially in this period of time, because remember, we're almost through all of the discussions on separating all of the various points of intersection between Post Office and Royal Mail. If Derek, had any concern about anything not being attended to properly, the kind of relationship we had is that he would have spoken to me, and I have no recollection of such conversation.
So we see its review of key system controls in Horizon. It's a draft report dated February 2012. If we turn to page 3, please. It talks about master data at the top. No audit trail exists for change requests received by Fujitsu from the Network Business Support Centre. It says at the bottom, implication. Implication, it is difficult to detect and prevent inappropriate changes being made to master data. And then Ernst & Young management letter at the bottom. It refers to the matters identified by the letter, and it says this: progress has been made in completing the actions arising from the Ernst & Young management letter. The Ernst & Young recommendations that require most additional work relate to, and then it lists out what those were. Did anyone tell you that at this point, contrary to what had been said before, the recommendations in the management letter remained outstanding and to be completed?
I don't recall that. And in other documents that have been provided, it seems like we were being informed as a board that good progress was being made.
Do you know where's the break? Why has there been a breakdown in communication? Can you help us with why the board was being given a different story?
I really can't, because I don't have any personal recollection of it, and I'm trying to piece it together from the documentation that the inquiry has provided. There was a lot going on, as there always was in Royal Mail around that time, and you know, I wish I could help more.
Is potentially a problem that there was a disconnect at this point between, or lack of communication between Post Office and the Royal Mail Board because of the impending separation?
I don't think so, because if you look at the whole architecture around how the separation was going to take place, it was very well thought out. All of the various points of intersection had team leaders from Royal Mail and from Post Office working together to try to assess what would be the impact if we had to become separated. What would be the service impact, and how did we make sure that we didn't drop the ball anywhere? That was a very big framework that underpinned all of the discussion that took place quite across both companies in every department. So it's hard for me to understand because there would have been a huge amount of communication taking place in the context of just trying to articulate what were the implications of the separation in almost every single aspect, from facilities to technology to finance to, you know, the corporate secretariat. So it's hard for me to understand how certain things like this did not get flagged up more.
So that's probably a good time to take the afternoon break, as I'm coming on to a new topic. I could ask we break until 3 o'clock.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. So can you continue to see and hear us?
I can.
Thank you. I'll continue. Dame Moya, I will now want to look at oversight of criminal and civil proceedings. Please could we have your witness statement at page 5, paragraph 13. You say the policy decision relating to Post Office separation was taken long before I arrived at Royal Mail. The Post Office operated in a fairly autonomous way and had clearly done so for some time. It had its own corporate functions, including, over the page please, finance, IT, HR, government relations, company secretary, marketing and legal. Pausing there, what do you mean by Post Office having its own legal function?
This was just an impression that I formed that in the general corporate function areas, they had people who specialized in those areas for the Post Office. And the impression was formed because when we were doing all of the work underpinning the separation, you know, we had to think about people and the tasks that they did and which ones of them would, under the transfer of undertakings, go to one organization or go to the other. And it seemed to me that in these corporate areas, and this, again, it's just an impression that I formed, in these corporate areas, it was very clear that there were some people in the legal area whose work was almost exclusively for the post office, and so they would go to the post office.
Just continuing on, it will may become relevant later. You also say the two companies operated from different headquarters, Royal Mail at Blackfriars, London, and the post office at Old Street, London. You refer to there being almost no overlap between staff at the two organisations.
That is my recollection.
Could we jump forward, please, to page 35, paragraph 103? If 103, please. Thank you. You're here speaking about the Ismay report, and you refer to David Smith, the Managing Director of Post Office, not raising it with him. And you say, I would have expected David Smith and Post Office Limited's Head of Criminal Law, Rob Wilson, to conclude that an independent review was necessary. Pausing there, was your understanding that Rob Wilson was the Head of Criminal Law for Post Office Limited?
Yes, but I don't remember him. I have learned that through this inquiry. And I apologize to Mr. Wilson if I have met him, but I don't remember him.
If we can bring that document down and bring up Poll 30/46235. This is a letter I think you were given this morning by the inquiry. And you see it's on Royal Mail headed paper. It says Legal Services, 3rd floor, 4A Eccleston Street. That looks like an address in Victoria, London. Do you recall that being an address operated by Royal Mail?
I don't, I'm sorry. We had a lot of sites, hundreds of them.
We see it's sent to Maureen Moore's National Security Team, Post Office Limited. And if we look down, please, see it concerns the case of Post Office Limited and Ishak. Now, Mr. Ishak was convicted of theft on the 7th of March 2013 and sentenced to 54 weeks imprisonment. His conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal in Hamilton and others and Post Office. And you'll have read from this document that Mr. Wilson gives advice and comments on the charging decision. You're nodding your head.
Yes, I'm sorry.
If we go to the end of the document, please, at the second page. It's Rob G. Wilson, Head of Criminal Law Division, and it's a Royal Mail email address, and at the bottom we have the Royal Mail is a trading name of Royal Mail Group Limited. Were you aware when you were CEO that Rob Wilson worked within Royal Mail itself?
I don't remember Rob Wilson, but I suppose I should do. I mean,
Well,
the evidence here is that he did.
Let's go wider. Were you aware of the criminal law team in the legal department of Royal Mail?
I was aware of a criminal law team, yes, because we in Royal Mail had offences as well as the post office did. So yes, I was aware of a criminal law team.
So when you say we had offences as well, are you there talking about where someone was, maybe an employee of Royal Mail, was accused of, say, opening envelopes or stealing them?
Yes, or stealing, special delivery, there were, a range of offences.
So you knew that the criminal law team within Royal Mail dealt with those types of offences or allegations?
Yes.
were you aware that the criminal law team within Royal Mail also dealt with prosecutions against sub-postmasters?
I wasn't. I thought that was dealt with by the criminal law team in the post office.
And let's explore that. What basis did you have for thinking there was a criminal law team within the post office?
Because I don't remember ever being briefed on sub-postmaster issues, except, very tangentially. I remember that from time to time, perhaps every half year, the board would get an overview of security matters in Royal Mail. And everything from, whether or not we were controlling our sites well enough, whether or not we had appropriate revenue protection in place, whether our products were properly designed to minimize, any loss of mail, because we were regulated on, the safety of the mail, the security of the mail. So I remember that, and in that context, I remember hearing about offenses that had been committed. And I mean, I'm sure that it would have included an overview for the whole group, but I don't specifically remember offenses against sub-postmasters. The first occasion, if I may, just to clarify, the first occasion when it really registered with me that, there was the potential for wrongful prosecutions of sub-postmasters was when I received the letter to me personally. I couldn't remember from whom it came, and it turns out on the basis of the evidence on the documentation that you provided me, it was Lord Arbuthnot. I'm just trying to explain to you that I don't remember sub-postmasters.
If I can pause you there, because we'll look at when you received that letter shortly. Given the Royal Mail criminal law team, which was within your company, was advising and was involved in the prosecution of sub-postmasters, do you accept you should have known that as Chief Executive?
Yes, I guess I should have known, but I didn't.
Who briefed you on the extent of the role of the criminal law team within Royal Mail when you joined the company?
When I joined the company, the senior team was in a state of flux, and I don't remember getting briefed on this. We had, at that point, the general counsel was a gentleman named Mr. Evans. He wasn't there for very long. We appointed then on an interim basis Jeff Triggs. I see from the documentation that has been provided to me from the inquiry that Jeff Triggs did include some information to our audit committees on sub-postmaster prosecutions, but I don't personally recall being briefed on that.
Could we look, please, at poll 20432-053? So this is the Master Services Agreement relating to the separation of Royal Mail Group and Post Office Limited. Could we turn to page 4, please? And we can see in the recitals that the second recital refers to it, that there's going to be a separation of the current corporate structure, so there'll be separate companies. And this agreement at C, it says, this agreement sets out the terms on which the provider shall provide the services to the recipient and makes provision for the transition or termination of the services. So in essence, what this is saying is before separation, Royal Mail provide services to Post Office Limited. After separation, we need to transition off those services, and this provides how that will happen.
Correct.
And I think you were involved in, reviewing and determining what services needed to go from Royal Mail to Post Office.
Correct.
Could we look, please, at page 147, which is part of the first schedule to the agreement. See, section M, it says services to cease, and this sets out the services that were to cease on separation itself. So effectively, these services come to a stop on, I think it's the 31st of March, but ready for separation in April. Correct?
Correct.
And we see work stream on the middle column and then description of the services to cease. Could we please turn to page 150? Is it possible to rotate that, please? Thank you. And 44. It appears we might be having some difficulty with that. I hope you'll take it from me.
I will.
For 44, it says legal in the middle column, and then on the right it says Pol legal. And then over the page, it says 49, legal in the middle column, and then in the right column it says criminal law. And then the page after the service end date is the 31st of March 2012. So this document shows that it was a part of the negotiations and agreement about the services of criminal law services from Royal Mail to Post Office stopping. Is your evidence you weren't aware that Royal Mail was providing criminal law services to Post Office Limited?
I guess I didn't think, it didn't register with me. I suppose if I, think about it, maybe it was all part of one team, but inside that team, certain individuals worked exclusively on Pol criminal legal work, and other individuals worked on Royal Mail criminal work. I'm just not sure.
Can we bring up, please, Pol 3031004? Sorry, so I think we're going to have to take a 5-minute break because the system has crashed, ironically. Could I ask you, sir, if you don't mind, just staying on screen, and we'll see if it can be fixed in a shorter period?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll just stay here quietly minding my own business till you tell me to pay attention again.
Thank you, sir. And Dame, I apologise. We'll try to sort this out.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, can you continue to see and hear us?
Yes, I can.
We've hopefully resolved that matter now. I'm going to go to a different document, actually. Can we please bring up Paul 3030800. So this is a Royal Mail Group policy, and we see at the top it's Royal Mail Group and then the business units, Post Office, Royal Mail and Postal Force, yes?
Correct.
And we see the owner is Rob Wilson, Head of Criminal Law Team.
Correct.
And if we can go over the page, please. It says the purpose of the policy includes 1.1.3, applies equally to employees at every level, whether frontline, management or executive, and to non-employees equally, whether contractors, customers, or having no formal relationship with the Royal Mail Group. So would you accept this is a group policy?
Yes.
And within its remit would be prosecutions against sub-postmasters?
Yes. Well, yes. Yes.
If we go to page 3, please.
The only hesitation I have, Mr. Stevens, is the date of this policy, because it was, I believe, in 2012, was it not?
If we go back to page 1, please. Should have taken you to the date, for which I apologise. It's date created September 2008. It's version 3, effective from April 2011.
Well, the only reason why I think the date is important is because as part of the separation process, and indeed in preparation for a hoped-for listing of Royal Mail, every policy in the company was updated. Every employment policy, every facilities management policy, and of course this policy would have been part of that. So I think some of them went back to 2008, but some of them were much older. And so the reason why I'm asking about the date is that when you ask me, does it apply to sub-postmasters, I guess it does in 2011. In 2012, it probably would not.
No, indeed, we don't need to turn it up, but there is a Post Office prosecution policy, version 1, that is from the 1st of April 2012. Reference for that, sir, for your benefit, is Pol 3031034. If we can turn them back to page 3, paragraph 4.5, it describes about the requirements of the Group Code of Conduct and says, in the event of any disagreement with prosecution advice in England and Wales or inconsistency between prosecution and conduct decisions anywhere in the United Kingdom, the head of the criminal law team and the head of the investigation team will consider the case and provide guidance and advice to ensure that the Royal Mail Group maintains a consistent prosecution policy. So the purpose of this document was at group level to ensure, and the two examples you used earlier, that someone's Royal Mail employees stealing, accused of stealing letters, and a sub-postmaster were prosecuted in accordance with the same policy.
Yes.
That can come down, thank you. In your witness statement, paragraph 12, page 5, you say, when I joined, my immediate priority was to resolve these issues in a way that would allow Royal Mail to satisfy the Financial Conduct Authority's eligibility requirements for admission of shares to the premium listing segment of the official list so that the company shares could be traded on the London Stock Exchange and attract investor interest. You go on to say, they necessitated a programme which involved a complete review of Royal Mail's policies, procedures and practices to enable Royal Mail to comply with its ongoing listing obligations, the finances and operations of the company, ongoing liabilities and risks, and the competencies of the executive team. Would you, as part of that, have reviewed and in your role as CEO, reviewed policies such as the prosecution policy I just took you to?
I remember reviewing a major, thick book of policies, but I cannot tell you for certain if I focused on this particular one. But I do remember being prepared for me a very large book of policies, so I expect that I would have read this, but I don't have a recollection of it now, but I expect I would have.
Would you agree that it's unusual for a business to bring private prosecutions?
It has been a thematic strand in this inquiry, but I have to say I am not as surprised as some people are, because you know, I had a very senior position in Canada when I was in the civil service in the Department of Transportation. And there were specialized police forces with investigation powers, and I believe in some cases prosecution powers. So I was not as surprised about that as some people have been.
But this is a private company. It may be owned by the government, but it's a company. Would you accept that it's unusual for a company to to pursue private prosecution?
I would accept that, but historically, you know, this company has unusual roots. Historically, it started off as a government department. So this may be a holdover from its historical background.
Would you agree that a business exposes itself to various risks if it brings prosecutions?
Yes, and it exposes itself to risks if it ignores offenses against it as well.
So, in bringing a prosecution, it could be criticised in how it took the decision to prosecute. Would you agree?
It could be.
It could be criticised for the conduct of the prosecution.
It could be. However, if the prosecution and the decision to prosecute is a good one and a fair one, backed by the kind of impartiality that would be expected, then I don't think that it necessarily presents a big risk.
Is what you've done there identified a risk, analysed it, and then suggested a mitigation for the risk?
Yes, but I would say, Mr. Stevens, in that framework, probably anything could be identified as a risk if it's not thought of properly.
There are clear and obvious risks arising from if prosecutions aren't pursued fairly. Would you agree with that? There's, for example, a risk of unsafe convictions.
Yes.
Would you agree that bringing private prosecutions calls for thorough oversight by the executive of the company that is pursuing those prosecutions?
Not necessarily on a case-by-case basis, no. I think if you have competent people and if they are exercising their duties properly, you know, and the executive team of a company cannot do every job in the company. So I think it depends.
You said there, if you had competent people, I think the other one was if they're doing their job properly. Would you accept the executive team has to have a system in place to check both of those things, satisfy itself those things are being done?
Yes.
Do you think extra care needs to be taken on those matters where the business is investigating and prosecuting alleged crimes where it itself is the alleged victim?
I think arguably yes.
What did the Royal Mail Board do in your time there to oversee or mitigate the risk of prosecutions against subpostmasters?
I think the most important thing that our board and our Audit and Risk Committee did under the aegis of the chairman, who was, until Ms. Perkins was appointed, also chairman of Post Office. When he read about, in private eye, he activated the risk management process of Royal Mail to make sure that they were apprised that there was an evolving situation that could indeed become a larger risk than it was being presented at that time.
Can I just pause you there? That's, I think you're referring to where a private eye article was raised and then queries were raised as to the integrity of the Horizon IT system and the
potential for group.
Potential for civil claim. That's slightly different from a proactive risk management approach of asking what the board did to satisfy itself that prosecutions against sub-postmasters were being carried out fairly.
All I can help the inquiry with is the information that has been provided to me, because I don't have a personal recollection. But I will say that as we put in place the risk management framework and developed the risk register system, it was a process that cut across the company entirely, including the subsidiaries. And so we had a bottom-up and a top-down approach to the identification of risks. And even though I cannot personally recall this, but in the legal department, they would have certainly flagged this up and decided what kind of a rating to give it on the risk register. So that's the first thing. And I think it was our Audit and Risk Committee under, I think Matthew Lester was the senior executive in charge of putting that process in place. But this was a framework that was only just beginning in the 2010-2012 period.
Can I just clarify? I think earlier in your evidence you said you don't recall seeing prosecutions against sub-postmasters being on the risk register.
I don't recall it, no. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't, and that doesn't mean that it wasn't discussed. It was a long time ago. I don't recall it.
Is the answer that the Royal Mail Board took no steps to oversee how prosecutions against sub-postmasters were being conducted?
I would not say that from the evidence that you have provided me with. As I say, we had, it was very clear where the management of risks in subsidiaries lay, and the management of, I think this particular set of risks probably started in Post Office, but from a group perspective and getting your arms around the risks of all subsidiaries in the organization, I certainly remember that being a preoccupation. I can't give you the exact date. And I think our board members were alert to emerging risks, and in that context called for information so that it could be assessed by the board. So I'm sorry, but I think you are being perhaps more categoric than I would be on that.
I want to move to a different topic and look at some of your discussions with Paula Vennells, please. Can we bring up Paul?
Before you do that, Mr. Stevens, can I just ask, because it's been wandering around in my mind as this discussion has been going on. Following separation, Dame Moya, Royal Mail Post Office in about 2013 either reduced very dramatically or ceased prosecuting sub-postmasters. It doesn't matter the reasons why for the purpose of my question. What about Royal Mail? In the period that you were chief executive between 2012 and 2018 when you ceased to be, did Royal Mail continue to prosecute its employees if they thought that appropriate?
Yes, from the information sir, that has been provided to me. Prosecutions reduced over time as we took other strategies to protect the mail and to protect our revenue, but there were prosecutions.
All right, thank you. Sorry, Mr. Stephen.
Not at all, sir. Thank you. Could we bring up the letter from Lord Arbuthnot to you? It's poll 20105483. I think you were referring to this email earlier. Sorry, letter earlier.
Yes, correct, sir.
Go down. There are two complaints in this email. One is about the closure of a post office. The second is in the second paragraph. It says, I'm concerned on a number of fronts. First, my constituents tell me that this case appears to be a continuation of the problems that post office employees have been having with the software system that reconcile takings. I'm aware of 34 individual employees throughout the country who feel they have been wrongly accused of fraud due to faults in this particular system. And goes on to discuss a meeting. And in your witness statement, we don't need to bring it up, but for you it's paragraph 112. You say you have a positive recollection of this letter.
I do. I didn't remember that it was Lord Arbuthnot, but I remembered getting a letter around this time which registered with me, and it registered with me because it was different from the way in which the issue had been described in our Audit and Risk Committee.
I think your statement, you refer to the 34 similar complaints. Is that something that triggered you?
It did, yeah.
Were you concerned that there may possibly be an issue with the prosecutions that Post Office have pursued at this point?
I didn't know about that. I was concerned that there was something wrong with the system, and the fault in the system was causing people to be falsely charged and horribly falsely convicted. So I didn't know that the process for the prosecutions was also the subject of such, disquieting and.
But you had a concern about the convictions because of the system.
I did. I thought, because what we were being told at the Audit Committee, and it's borne out in the minutes, we were told that there's no problem with the system. And we were also told that there were a few people who were blaming the system, but the fault was not with the system. This caused me to think about it in a different way.
Were you concerned that there may be claims against Royal Mail Group?
No, not at all. I mean, it's hard for people to imagine, but, we had the biggest fleet in the country. We had thousands and thousands of suppliers. We had lots of claims against Royal Mail. And so, I was not worried about claims about Royal Mail. What I was worried about was that there might be people who are being wrongfully convicted on the basis of a false belief on our part that the system is, faultless.
That document can come down, thank you. You in your statement, refer to a conversation that you had, or you remember having with Paula Vennells thereafter. Did you express those concerns to her?
Yes.
And what did she say in response?
Well, I had suggested to Mrs. Vennells that we really needed to do a complete drains-up, root and branch review of that system, taking into account, what people were saying about it. This was not any longer just a handful. I mean, this is a significant group of people. And she said that the system had been reviewed. It had been reviewed on multiple multiple occasions, that there was no problem with the system, that there could be issues around keying errors, but she had, there's certainly, what I recall from the conversation, she didn't think we needed to do the sort of independent review that I was suggesting.
Why didn't you go ahead with an independent review within Royal Mail?
That's a good question. I think I was somehow given reassurance that it had been tested, it had been reviewed, but also at that time, you know, all of the issues, the substantive issues around separation had been resolved. We had in the Post Office Board and in the Royal Mail Board, our executive teams had been given the go-ahead to sign the agreement. So the practices and conventions and protocols that were in place for companies that were entirely separate, those were live. And for those two reasons, I didn't press it further at that time.
Did you think at that point that that is an issue, the allegation of potentially unsafe convictions? Did you see that as being something that totally transferred to Post Office on separation?
Yes, because, you know, I thought that the prosecutorial function, even if it may have come under the heading of Royal Mail Group, I thought it was a team inside the Royal Mail Group that carried out all of those tasks.
So what do you mean by that when you say you thought it was a team?
I thought that, well, let me try to put it in context. When we did all of the work on the separation in all areas of the company, we had teams working at all levels. And there was an escalation process if there were any issues or, you know, you couldn't get to resolution as to how that particular area was going to be dealt with. Nobody raised to me in the context of that there was any issue with respect to legal or criminal law. And my assumption, perhaps wrong, was that this was a pretty easy group of employees to move to the post office. My assumption was because they had spent most of their daily working time on post office matters.
So you, at this time, you did know there was a team in Royal Mail working on the criminal law aspects, which was to transfer over. That's what I'm trying to...
Well, I'm just saying to you that it wasn't raised to me as an issue. I knew that there was a Royal Mail criminal law team, but perhaps wrongly, I thought inside that team there were dedicated resources that were working on criminal law matters for post office. That would have been my assumption. So in my conversations with Mrs. Vennells, first, I didn't know at that time that there was any issue about the oppressive and harsh nature in which the prosecutions were being conducted. But secondly, and I think more importantly, I thought there was a separation between prosecutorial matters inside the post office versus prosecutorial matters inside the Royal Mail.
I'm going to jump forward quite significantly in the timeline now. Can we bring up PVEN 50500? And page 2, please. These were documents provided by Paula Vennells to the inquiry to suggest that they're messages in 9th of May 2022. Do you accept these are text messages between you and Paula Vennells?
Yes.
Can we go down, please, to the one at 8:41? Thank you. You say at the bottom, Horizon is the real villain here, and thank God we finally learned about the frailty in the system. We think of it as computerised, it is untamperable, infallible. Not so. Stand tall. I know you are a good person and would never, never accuse anyone in the wrong. Can I ask what you meant when you said that last line? I know you are a good person and would never, never accuse anyone in the wrong.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I thought this would be a private communication, and I want to just say there's a context to this. Mrs. Vennells was being vilified in the press, and we didn't know at that time in 2022 what we know now as a result of the evidence that has emerged in this inquiry. And so at that time, I could only say what I saw. And what I saw when I worked with Mrs. Vennells was a hardworking executive who was a problem solver and not at all the kind of person that she has been portrayed.
So this is effectively supportive, saying you wouldn't accuse anyone of doing anything wrong without a basis or something along those lines.
Well, I think it speaks for itself.
Can we please bring up PVEN 50533? It's another message. It says, Dear Paula, what a terrible time. Just tell the truth. I know you're a good person and friends will be hard to find now. What has happened is a terrible, horrible thing. So many lives ruined, yours too. Just tell the truth, what you knew, what you thought at the time, what they told you, any mistakes you made. Do you recall roughly when you sent this text message and what prompted you to send it?
I think I had been traveling, and I had come back into the country after an extended trip, and I think you know, my YouTube artificial intelligence was sending up things for me to watch, but I can't remember exactly.
We see over the page there's a reply, and then the message starts, Paula, I'm just back in the UK. If we could then bring up PVEN 50532. So we see that message picking up there. Paula, I'm just back in the UK. What I've learned from the inquiry, parliamentary committee questions is very damaging. Nick was a poor witness. Is that Nick Reed?
Yes.
Chairman is gone. He will be next. When it was clear the system was at fault, the Post Office should have raised a red flag, stopped all proceedings, given people back their money, and then tried to compensate them for the ruin this caused in their lives. Go over the page. It says, yes, I agree. This is a reply. Yes, I agree. This is taking too long, Moya. The toll on everyone it affected is dreadful. I hope you had a good break and are well. You then say, I don't know what to say. I think you knew. What did you think Paula Vennells knew?
Oh, gosh. I think she knew, on the basis of the evidence that has emerged in this inquiry, that there were faults in the system. I think that post office executives, including Mrs. Vennells, continued to slavishly, in my opinion, adhere to the position that was not tenable on the basis of the evidence presented here, that there were no faults, or, you know, if you look at the evidence that has been given in my bundle and has been presented to the inquiry, going back to 2008, Fujitsu told post office employees, I don't know who, that there was the ability to manipulate branch accounts remotely. And then in 2010, it was that information went beyond that individual exchange between Fujitsu and post office. It went now into post office, 2011.
Can I just, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, can I pause you there? One thing I want to ask here is when there's a change from the message I took you to at first to here, and you're now saying, I think you knew, the change and the points you're making there, what is the basis of the knowledge? Is it things that have come out in this inquiry?
Yes.
Is there anything else that you're basing that on?
No.
Has anything that's come out in this inquiry made you reflect on past events, conversations with others when you were in post in Royal Mail in a different way?
Well, the only conversations I had were with people who would probably be as shocked as I am that all of the assertions and undertakings that had been given to all of us, the executive team of Royal Mail, the Audit and Risk Committee of Royal Mail, these were just not so. So I don't think that those conversations would have helped me. It was really what changed my mind was the evidence that has come out of this inquiry.
So I perhaps didn't ask, my question is slightly different. It's when you have seen something in this inquiry and what you've learned through the inquiry, has any of that, when you're looking back on conversations you may have had with Paula Vennells in 2015, 2011, has any of that information given you a different reflection on that conversation, or do you see it in a different light?
I do see it in a different light. Because I do think that we were misled. I think that it was grossly understated, the gravity of the situation, and it has had calamitous results for people. So I think we were misled, and this assertion continued, you know, for a very long time.
So those are all the questions I have. I understand there may be questions from corporate participants. If I just may take a moment to get time estimates out. We had a slight break with the document. So we do have requests. Mr. Henry has asked for, I think, 10 to 12 minutes. And it's just Mr. Henry, sir.
Right. Well, I'm sure that Mr. Henry will adhere to his time estimate. So over to you, Mr. Henry.
Absolutely, sir. Dame Moya, you're a strong leader. Would you agree?
I don't think it's for me to say, Mr. Henry.
But you have clear objectives which you communicate clearly to the people who work with you.
I have tried to do that, yes.
Yeah. And you set the tone about what had to be done and how it was to be accomplished, so far as the separation, the investability, and the ultimate flotation, together, of course, with Sir Donald.
Yes, and a very strong executive team.
Yeah. Now, if it had become apparent that unpredictable, intermittent bugs, errors, and defects in Horizon had led to the prosecution, conviction, and imprisonment of innocent people, That would have threatened your objectives, would it not?
No?
Why not?
Well, my objectives were to modernize the company, to establish better relationships with our employees, better relationships with our unions, to modernize the technology, to try to create a company that had a customer focus.
Can I stop you there,
Those were
Jane
my
Moya?
objectives. And so, you know, if we were doing something wrong, I would not shy away from it.
Right. So let's then proceed with that clear and unambiguous statement. You wouldn't have shied away from it, but it would have had a massive setback to the separation and the investability of the entity, would it not? Because you would have had this grotesque and appalling scandal, wouldn't you, unfolding on your watch?
Well, I would say if I knew then what I know now, I would certainly not have managed this horrible, grotesque, to use your word, in the way in which it was managed. My view is that when you find out that something has been done in gross error like this, you put your hand up and you try to set it right as fast as you can. And you know, and if you do that, as an organization, you're far better off than if you just let things drift and get bigger and cause more ruination to people.
And everybody would agree with what you just said. So why didn't you surface the risk?
Well, I go back. I think we did. You know, if I look at.
I'm sorry, you think you surfaced the risk?
Well, we didn't understand the risk because we were deliberately, in my opinion, misled.
Part of it, though, you surely must accept, is that significant risks which are contained in papers were merely marked for noting. So, for example, litigation reports were marked for noting on your watch. You accept that?
Yes, but that is not, in my opinion, Mr. Henry, and I don't want to, you know, seem in any way argumentative. We knew where we had claims. We knew what the value of those claims were. We knew how much cash we had to reserve against those claims. We didn't shy away from that. What we were told is that this is a small number of claims. The likelihood of success, I think the word that was used was remote. This was a gathering storm, I would say. And when we activated the risk management system to at least surface it, the way in which it was described was a gross understatement of what it was.
And that is, and I'm going to come to that, but now that you have raised it, paragraph 137 of your statement, no need to take you to it, but you said prior to separation, as I've explained above, the narrative had focused on the audit preparedness of Fujitsu, the small number of threatened claims by sub-postmasters, and the insistence that Horizon was not at fault. All of this now appeared to me an entirely incorrect characterization of the issues. Now, this was your point of view, however, in 2015, 2016. Why didn't you get to grips with it before separation? You say that you were misled.
I think we were misled. It certainly was. It was the sort of mischaracterization of a terrible situation, of a gathering storm. It was a mischaracterization that was so great as to be incomprehensible.
So how did Mr. Trigg mislead you? Because the reports that you did not read, and the reports that were noted that he prepared characterised it in that way.
Well, but he also said that the likelihood of the post office being liable in these matters was not great. And he had the advice of a very respected barrister. And so, as I said, we didn't shy away from assigning cash to claims. We had lots of claims. In fact, I think 75 million pounds was assigned to in one report that I saw. So I think this was a complete mischaracterization of this horrible, horrible situation. And of course, the longer that situations like this go on, you know, the worse it is for the poor people whose lives are being ruined, and also for the corporation who's, you know, needing to be able to turn the page and I'll stop there.
Could we go to the Ismay report? You've got no recollection of the Ismay report?
No.
If it had become apparent that the Ismay report was a complete whitewash, that presumably, again, would have been something that would have disrupted the separation and flotation.
No, I don't think so, because if, you know, as I said, we had lots of claims. We had lots of technology risk. The entire technology estate of the Royal Mail Group was needing a complete revamping. So, and our whole approach was we will just start.
You'll just deal with it. You'll deal with it.
We'll deal with it.
But you were, again, misled. Now, are you sure that you have absolutely nothing to do with the commission of the Ismay report? Because the Ismay report occurred, or rather it was commissioned. We have heard from evidence, and it can be provided to you, 6 days after you assumed your post as CEO of RMG, and that Mr. David Smith commissioned it on the 21st of July of the year that you took over, 2010. And Mr. Ismay, in evidence, said that he had about 2 weeks to prepare it. Did it have absolutely nothing to do with your revamping and, as it were, stress testing of all of the systems that had to be dealt with in order to meet the FCA eligibility requirements?
Absolutely nothing.
Thank you.
You know, and I only learned about how bad it was our technology state much later.
Now, can I go to one final thing before I close? And this is a document that Mr. Stevens took you to. It's POL 000-30217. And you'll remember this is dealing with the Ernst & Young report from the 27th of March 2011. And you were saying to Mr. Stevens that essentially the complexion was that Fujitsu weren't prepared for the audit. In other words, somehow or other, the message about remote access got spun or laundered to be about Fujitsu's audit preparedness rather than this red flag which exists in the report. Could we go, please? It's your paragraph 73 in your witness statement where you say that even if you had read it, you wouldn't have regarded it as creating a problem with Horizon because you just thought that it was to do with, as it were, hygiene concerning access. Mr. Stevens took you to page 33 of the report. Could we go to the internal pagination, page 34? And could we go top left hand? Yes. Add top box, admin access parameter, ADM, etc., etc., etc. And then I'm going to omit words and go down to the last 6 lines. Unrestricted access to privileged IT functions increases the risk of unauthorized, inappropriate access, which may lead to the processing of unauthorized or erroneous transactions. For prosecutions that were predicated on the integrity of the Horizon system, that was clearly a risk that ought to have been drawn to your attention there and then. Do you agree?
I guess so, if it had been put together the way you just have done.
But it's there in black and white.
Well, it is part of a much larger document, Mr. Henry. But yes, I think it should have been drawn to our attention.
It's actually in the executive summary on page 3, one of the opening lines of the document. You had to strengthen the review of privileged access. Do you see? It's 4 lines from the bottom of the page. Strengthen the review of privileged access. I mean, it ought to have been staring you, Dame Moya, in the face, and you ought to have got a grip on it.
I must say, I can understand why you would take that point of view. I would only ask you to consider the following. It was in the context of our outside auditor telling us that they had themselves, despite the failures of Fujitsu in getting themselves properly prepared to do a financial year-end closeout, that they had themselves tested the systems and that they had found that the systems were reliable and that there was no integrity of data problem. Secondly, in response to what had happened in the 2010-2011 audit, where they had to do more work and they were very put out about that, and it had cost more money, it had been inefficient. In addition to that, in response, we had set in place with Post Office Limited a whole follow-up piece of work.
I'm going to stop you there because you have referred to them. It's POL 000291114, POL 000030482, again, neither of which you claim to have seen or read, even though you're on the circulation list, the Internal Audit Review of Horizon.
But that is true, Mr. Henry.
I mean, the fact is, this was never bottomed out or resolved under your leadership before separation, was it?
I don't think that's correct. If you look at the work that had been done, the follow-up work that had been done by Derek Foster in the internal audit group, it's a very detailed piece of work. He set in place in the post office a group that was charged with managing every single item that had been raised in that management letter. And progress was reported on a regular basis. So I must say I cannot agree with you there. Even I did not have the primary responsibility with the external audit group. That was, of course, our chief financial officer. But that does not mean that the work that had been identified here, and in fact, if you go to the audit plan of E&Y for the following year, where they talk about how they are going to approach a very extensive piece of work, because now they have to present financials for the 2 companies, you will see that they have put in place measures where they would use their own software to test every single aspect of the systems that would relate to the reporting of data, whether in the post office or in Royal Mail. So I can understand how you would take the position that you have taken, but I would ask you to consider those matters.
Dame Moya, I have nothing further to ask you. Thank you for answering my questions.
So, Ms. Patrick has actually asked as well for 5 minutes. I said before to her, I think, about asking this question, and it's my error, misunderstanding.
Well, Ms. Patrick, I don't want to stop you, obviously, but is it something that's going to the heart of the problems that I have, or is it peripheral, do you think?
So it's simply something that Dame Moya has raised herself about her reaction to Mr Arbuthnot's letter. I'd like to pick up some correspondence on behalf of Mr Julian Wilson that was sent shortly thereafter.
All right. Yeah, all right.
Dame Moya, I'm going to take this as quickly as I possibly can. I represent some other sub-postmasters who were convicted and have had their convictions overturned, including Mr Trousdale, who sits on my right, and Miss Hamilton on my left. Before we go on with the question I have, Mr Stevens raised with you the involvement of Royal Mail Group and Royal Mail Group Legal in prosecutions pre-separation. Can you help us? Who was responsible at executive level or board level for oversight of the legal team in Royal Mail Group?
The General Counsel.
And who did the General Counsel report to?
Me.
Thank you. And turning to the questions that I wanted to address, the inquiry is very familiar with Mr Wilson. Mr Julian Wilson, his wife, Mrs Karen Wilson, is a core participant. Mr Wilson died before his conviction could be overturned in 2021. And she gave very powerful evidence in phase 1 as to the human impact on him of his conviction. He'd been very actively involved in the Justice for Subpostmasters group before his death. Now, I don't want to take this too slowly. A number of our clients were prosecuted pre-separation, and the inquiry has the documents. Mr Wilson's investigation and trial documents appear under a Royal Mail Group banner. Now, you've talked about the correspondence with Mr Arbuthnot and that changing your perception, and the 34 cases being particularly relevant to you. Now, in your witness statement, you also deal with a letter being received from Mrs Karen Lumley, MP, on behalf of Mr Julian Wilson. And that's, we won't turn it up, it's page 1, paragraph 127 and 128 of your witness statement. You said you can't recall seeing that correspondence. And if we can turn it up very quickly, it's Paul 3058098. And it'll come up, while it's coming up, the date on it, if you recall, is July 2012. So after you've seen the letter from Mr Arbuthnot, is that fair, Ms Dame Moya?
Yes, it was, I think the letter, the date there was December 2011, was that correct?
So after your perception might have changed about these repeated claims. Now, if we turn to page 2, we'll see Mr Wilson's original message. And I know you've had a chance to look at this in preparation for today. You can read it yourself very briefly, but he's reacting to the appointment of an independent forensic accountant. Can you see that there?
I can.
And he's raising 3 questions about the appointment and whether it's independent, whether they're going to look first at the computer because he's saying he thinks that's the problem. And finally, he raises a specific point about whether the independent review is going to raise a particular issue about transaction management. Can you see that there, Dave Moya?
Yes.
So they're all questions about the independent review. And I think you've said that by this time you were all for a drained-up root and branch review. Dave Moya, you're nodding. I have to say, you have to...
I beg your pardon, yes.
So you were all for, by this point, root and branch independent review, and that's what you were suggesting to Mrs Vennells?
Yes.
Now, can we look at the reply very quickly? The reply you can see at Paul 2014343, and it doesn't come from you. And your witness statement, you say you can't recall if you saw a reply.
No.
Is that right? Now, it's very similar. If we scroll through the reply when it comes up, to a lot of correspondence the inquiry has seen in reply to Subpostmaster messages. It's Paul 2014343. Thank you very much. We take it very quickly, I think. If we scan through, you can see the first few paragraphs. It's responding to the MP's message. You'll be aware in the email deals with the independent review. The third paragraph has been appointed. The scope of the investigation is yet to be finalised. To assure impartiality, Mr Arbuthnot has reviewed and approved the appointment. And then, I won't look at the detail, but if we can scroll through the next 4 paragraphs, it's dealing with the specific thing he asked the independent reviewer to consider. And if we scroll to the last of the 3 paragraphs there, it ends with interruptions to service connections do not create an issue for the Horizon system. Over the past 10 years, many millions of branch reconciliations have been carried out by the 25,000 sub-postmasters and their staff in post office branches, and transactions and balances accurately recorded. We continue to have absolute confidence in the robustness and integrity of the Horizon system and our branch accounting processes. Dear Moya, if you had seen this reply, it's going out to bat for the post office again, isn't it?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
It's going out to bat for the system again, isn't it? It's saying the system's fine.
I agree.
If you had seen this after your perception had changed, having seen the James Arbuthnot letter, would you have been happy with this response going out in reply to a letter to you?
No.
Now, this is after you've seen the Arbuthnot letter. You know this correspondence, I assume, had come in. Do you see correspondence that comes to you?
Not necessarily. Oftentimes it is handled by the executive correspondence teams in Royal Mail and in Post Office.
Let's put that to one side. He's writing to you as the he's written to his MP. His MP's directed it to you as the parent at the time he was investigated. Now, Mr Wilson aside, having had your perception changed by the James Arbuthnot letter, and knowing that Royal Mail Group had been the post office parent for a very long time, did you ever look back and think, what were we doing? Did we have any role in this?
I never asked that question, but I did ask questions going forward. But at that point, we were brushed aside. And I think the evidence that has been provided to me in my bundles show that.
Dear Moya, you asked questions, but today, in response to questions from Mr Stevens, you didn't know that Royal Mail Group Legal had been in the thick of these prosecutions.
I thought it was the Post Office legal team.
Okay. Dear Moya,
Who signed that letter? I can't see on the screen.
So it's not Dear Moya, it's executive correspondence. Donna Gilhooly, sir.
Yeah. So it is an answer by Royal Mail, because by now, of course, separation has occurred, hasn't it?
Yes, no, this is not Royal Mail, I don't think, I'm not
No,
sure.
Dear
I think
Moya,
it's
I
the
wasn't
Post
suggesting.
Office.
That's why I suggested, Dear Moya, if you had seen it, would you have agreed with it?
No.
Thank you. Sorry, sir. There was no
No,
indication.
I just wanted to be clear, that's all, about the sequence. I am now, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, dear Moya. I have no other questions.
So we have also received a request from Dame Moya's recognised legal representative to take a point of clarification in re-examination. I don't think it's a short point, David.
Pressure, so it's just a very short point. Could we bring up Rob Wilson's witness statement, please, which is WITN 042-10100. And if we could go to page 2 of that document, please. And while that comes up, Dame Moya, you'll remember that Mr Stevens raised the question as to the entity which employed Rob Wilson and his role, and that point has been come back to on a number of occasions. Perhaps I could just take you to paragraph 3 of his statement. The first sentence, he says, in May 2002, I was appointed head of the POL CLT, which I think is the criminal law team. And then about 5 lines down in that same paragraph, he says, my main role was the responsibility for all criminal prosecutions brought on behalf of Post Office Limited. And then perhaps we could scroll on to paragraph 4 of that same statement, please, on the next page, where Mr. Wilson says, on the 1st of April 2012, so at separation, I left Post Office Limited and moved into Royal Mail. So obviously we don't have his employment contract, but we do have his statement which says that. I wanted to draw that to the inquiry's attention. Obviously, Dame Moya may want to comment on that, but that may not be necessary.
No.
Well, I think I was aware of Mr. Wilson's statement, and I'm also aware that during the course of the inquiry there has been a degree of looseness, if I can put it in that way, about precisely who worked for whom when.
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Stevens.
Yes, that's all. That's all the questions, yes.
I'm very grateful to you, Dame Moya, for making your witness statement and for giving evidence before me orally and answering a great many questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, sir.
Right. We'll resume on Tuesday, Mr. Stevens.
Yes, sir. Thank you.